How do you do? Storyteller here, back with another episode reading the Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 2 of Book 2, The Hill. Then I saw John, bounding forward on the road so slightly that before he knew it, he had come upon the top of a little hill. It was not because the hill had tired him that he stopped there, but because he was too happy to move. "There is no landlord," he cried. Such a weight had been lifted from his mind that he felt like he could fly. All around him the frost was gleaming like silver. The sky was like blue grass. A robin sat on the hedge beside him. "There is no landlord," he laughed, and when he thought of the old card of rules hung over his bed in the bedroom, so low and dark in his father's house, "There is no landlord, there is no black hole," he turned and looked back on the road he had come by, and when he did so he gasped with joy. For there in the east, under the morning light, he saw the mountains heaped up the sky like clouds, green and violet, dark and red. Shadows were passing over the big rounded slopes, and water shone in the mountain pools. And up at the highest of all was the sun, smiling steadily on the ultimate crags. These crags were so indeed shaped that you could easily mistake them for a castle, and now it came into John's head that he had never looked at the mountains before, because as long he thought that the landlord lived there, he had been afraid of them. But now that there was no landlord, he perceived that they were beautiful. For a moment he almost doubted whether the island could be more beautiful, or whether he could be wiser to go east instead of west. But it did not seem to him to matter, for he said, "If the world has the mountains at one end and the island at the other, then every road leads to beauty, and the world is glory among glories." At that moment he saw a man walking up the hill to meet him. Now I knew in my dream that this man's name was Mr. Virtue, and he was a man of age with John, or a little bit older. "What is the name of this place?" asked John. "It is called Jehovah-Jireh," said Mr. Virtue. Then they both turned and continued their journey to the west. After they had gone a little way, Mr. Virtue stole a glance at John's face, and he smiled a little. "Why do you smile?" said John. "I was thinking that you look very glad." "So would you be if you had lived in fear of the landlord all your life, and had just discovered that you were a free man." "Oh, is that?" "Yeah. Oh, it's that, is it?" "You don't believe in the landlord, do you?" "I know nothing about him, except by hearsay like the rest of us." "You wouldn't like to be under his thumb?" "Wouldn't like? I wouldn't be under anyone's thumb." "You might have to, if he had a black hole." "I'd let him put me in the black hole sooner than take orders if the orders were not to my mind." "Why, I think you're right. I can hardly believe it yet, that I need not obey the rules. There's that robin again. To think that I could have a shot at it if I liked, and no one would interfere with me." "Do you want to?" "I'm not sure that I do," said John, fingering at his sling. But when he looked round the sunshine and remembered the great happiness and looked twice at the bird, he said, "No, I don't. There's nothing I want less. Still, I could if I liked." "You mean you could if you chose?" "What's the difference?" "All the difference in the world." Chapter 3. A Little Southward. I thought that John would have questioned him further, but now they came in sight of a woman who was walking slower than that they had presently come up with her and wished her good day. When she turned, they saw that she was young and comely, though a little dark of complexion. She was friendly and frank, but not wanton, and the whole world became pleasanter to the young men because they were travelling in the same way with her. But first they were told their names, and she told them hers, which was Media Halfways. "And where are you travelling to, Mr. Virtue?" she asked. "To travel hopefully is better than to arrive," said Virtue. "Do you mean you're just out for a walk, then, just for exercise?" "Certainly not," said Virtue, who was becoming a little confused. "I am on a pilgrimage. I must admit, now that you press me, I have not a very clear idea in mind, But that's not an important question. These speculations don't make one a better walker. The great thing to do is one's 30 miles a day.
Why?
Because that's the rule. Oh, said John. So you do believe in the landlord after all? Not at all. I didn't say it was the landlord's rule.
Whose rule is it then?
It is my own rule. I made it myself.
But why?
Well, that again is a speculative question. I have made the best rules I can. If I find any better ones, I shall adopt them. In the meantime, the great thing to do is to have rules for some sort and to keep them.
And where are you going?
And where are you going? Said Media, turning to John. Then John began to tell his companions about the island and how he had first seen it, and was determined to give up everything in hope of finding it.
Then you had better come and see my father, she said. He lives in the great city of Thrill, and at the bottom of the hill there is a turn to the left which will bring us there in half an hour.
Has your father been to the island? Does he know the way?
He often talks about something very much like it.
You'd better come with us, Virtue, said John.
Since you do not know where you're going, and there can be no place better to go than the island.
Certainly not, said Virtue. We must keep to the road. We must keep on.
I don't see why, said John.
I dare you don't say, said Virtue.
Bleh.
I dare say you don't, said Virtue.
All this time they were going down the hill, and now they came to a little grassy lane on the left, which went off through the wood. Then I thought that John had a little hesitation, but partly because the sun was now hot, and the hard metal of the road was becoming sore to his feet, and partly because he was a little angry with Virtue, and most of all because Media was going that way, he decided to turn down the lane. They said goodbye to Virtue, and he went his way, stumping up the next hill without ever looking back. Chapter 4. Soft Going. When they were in the lane, they walked more gently. The grass was softer under their feet, and the afternoon sun began beating down on the sheltered place, making it warm. And presently they heard the sound of sweet and melancholy chimes. "Those are the bells of the city," said Media. They went together and walked closer together, and soon they were walking arm in arm. Then they kissed each other, and after that they went on their way kissing and talking in low voices of sad and beautiful things. And the shadow of the wood and the sweetness of the girl and the sleepy sound of the bells reminded John a little bit of the island and a little bit of the girls. "This is what I've been looking for all of my life," said John. "The girls before were too gross and the island too fine. This is the real thing." "This is love," said Media with a deep sigh. "This is the way of the real island." Then I dreamed that they came in sight of the city, a very old and full of spires and turrets, all covered with ivy, where it lay in a little grassy valley built on both sides of a lazy, winding river. And they passed the gate into the ruinous old city, and came and knocked at a certain door and were let in. Then Media brought him into the darkish room with a vaulted roof and windows of stained glass, and exquisite food was brought to them. With the food came old Mr. Halfways. He was a gliding gentleman with soft silver hair and a soft silver voice, dressed in flowing robes, and he was so solemn with his long beard that John was reminded of the steward with his mask on. But it is much better than the steward, thought John, because there is nothing to be afraid of. Also, he doesn't need a mask. His face is really like that. Chapter 5. Leah for Rachel. As they ate, John told them about the island. "You will find your island here," said Mr. Halfway, looking into John's eyes. "But how can it be a place here in the city?" "It needs no place. It is everywhere and nowhere. It refuses entry to no one who asks. It is the island of the soul," said the old gentleman. "Surely even Puritania told you that the landlord's castle was within you." "But I don't want the castle," said John, "and I don't believe in the landlord." "What is the truth?" said the old man. "They were mistaken when they told you of the landlord, and yet they were not mistaken. When the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not.
The landlord they dream to find, we find in our hearts. The island you seek for, you already inhabit. The children of that country are never far from their fatherland. When the meal was ended, the old gentleman took a harp, and at the first sweep of his hand across the strings, John began to think of the music he had heard by the window in the wall. Then came the voice, and it was no longer merely silvery and sweet and melancholy like Mr. Halfway's speaking voice, but strong and noble and full of strange overtones, the noise of the sea and all of the birds, and sometimes the wind and the thunder. And John began to see a picture of the island with his eyes open. But it was more than a picture, for he sniffed the spicy smell of the sharp brine of the sea mixed with it. He seemed to be in the water, only a few yards from the island. He could see more than he had ever seen before, but just as he had put down his feet and touched the sandy bottom and was beginning to wade ashore, the song ceased. The whole vision went away. John found himself back in a dusky room, seated in a low divan, with Media by his side. "Now I shall sing you something else," said Mr. Halfway. "Oh, no," cried John, who was sobbing. "Sing the same again. Please sing it again." "You had better not hear it twice in the same evening. I have plenty of other songs." "I would die to hear the first one again," said John. "Well, well," said Mr. Halfways. "Perhaps you know it best. Indeed, what does it matter? It is as short to the island as one way to another." Then he smiled indulgently and shook his head, and John could not help thinking that his talking voice and talking manner were almost silly after the singing. But soon as the great deep wall of music began, and it swept everything else from his mind, it seemed to him that this time he got more pleasure from the first few notes, and noted delicious passages which had escaped him in the first hearing, and he said to himself, "This is going to be even better than the other. I shall keep my head this time and sip in all the pleasure at my ease." I saw that he settled more comfortably and listened, and Media slipped her hand into his. It pleased him to think that they were going to the island together. Now came the vision of the island again, but this time it was changed, for John scarcely noticed the island because of the lady with a crown on her head who stood waiting for him on the shore. She was fair, divinely fair, and he began again to wade ashore, holding out his arms to embrace that queen, and his love for her appeared to him so great and so pure that they had been parted for so long, and that this pity for himself had almost overwhelmed him. And as he was about to embrace her, the song stopped again. "Sing it again! Sing it again!" cried John. "I liked it better the second time." "Well, if you insist," said Mr. Halfway with a shrug. "It's nice to have a really appreciative audience." And he sang it again for the third time. And this time John noticed yet more about the music. He began to see how the several effects were produced, and some parts were better than others. He wondered if he shall not trifle too long. The vision of the island was a little shadowy this time. He did not take much notice of it. He put his arm around Media, and they lay cheek to cheek. He began to wonder if Mr. Halfway's would never end. And when at last the final passage closed, with a sobbing break in the singer's voice, the old gentleman looked up and saw how the young people lay in each other's arms, and then he rose and said, "You have found your island. You have found it in one another's hearts." And he tiptoed from the room, wiping his eyes. And I believe it is there we will stop, because I've read 3 chapters in. I know that they're very small chapters, but I try to keep this short, sweet, and to the point. I try to keep these a little enjoyable to read and not too long. You don't want your mind to stray, so I will leave it there just before we start chapter 6. So that has been the most recent episode of The Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye!